Thank you so much, by the way. I won't waste question time by saying thank you very much, that was amazing. This is for Pragya. You mentioned that Harold, the would-be king, Godwinson, didn't like the fact that his little brother Tostig was going to get Northumberland. So that's why Tostig got sent away, which is why it's called Harold Hardrada, which is sort of why, like, the Vikings invaded again and the Battle of Stamford Bridge. If Harold had just shared with his little brother, is it possible that Harold would have had more time to defeat the Normans at the Battle of Hastings and that none of this could have
Alternative histories are absolutely wonderful. Absolutely. I may have slightly misled you about how complex the situation was among the various earldoms that occupied England, what eventually became the Kingdom of England. The main issue with the spat between the brothers is that Godwin has spent quite a lot of time under Canute and after Canute died, so making himself indispensable to the kingdom. And at one point, all of Godwin's numerous sons hold earldoms in different parts of the kingdom. So if it's effectively already a sort of Godwin family holding. And Tostig kind of slightly throws a spear, a spoke in the wheel, that's the very last one, by demanding Northumberland, Northumbria, not Northumberland, Northumbria. And it's further complicated by some sources that suggest that Tostig was a favourite of his sister and therefore his brother-in-law, Edward the Confessor. And so he was likely to get Northumbria, but he hadn't really been a very good earl of, I think it's Sussex at that point. So they weren't, so the people who really ran the kingdom, i.e. Harold and his brothers, weren't keen on giving such a large earldom, such an important earldom, to Tostig, who hadn't really acquitted himself very well. And that's kind of the politics behind not wanting Tostig to be Earl of Northumbria. And as sort of both Alex and Sarah have demonstrated, Northumbria is really, really important to the Kingdom of England. So you don't want to hand it to someone who's not going to handle it properly. And that's the crux of the problem with Tostig. And the only way to deal with it is to send him into exile. Vita Bordi, which is The Life of King Edward, sort of suggests that it was the loss of Tostig that sort of led to Edward possibly having a stroke and basically falling ill and eventually dying. So there's all sorts of drama. As I say, this is all drama. This is all family drama. But from a political point of view, there is that sort of consolidation aspect under Harold. Harold doesn't want to give up a significant portion of his power to his brother, but there's also the question of Tostig's capabilities that is raised. I should caveat all of this by saying that a lot of this information comes to us from later sources, so how much of this is embellishment, how much of it is sort of lived memory, it's hard to tell. But yeah, I don't think Harold was going to share, basically.
Question.
Sorry if this is an incorrect question. Do you think that the Viking and Norman invasions could mount colonialism? And could you explain why you think it could or couldn't?
Well, we can definitely say that somebody, Jim Lang, who studies the sculpture of Viking Age Yorkshire, studies the sculpture of Viking Age Yorkshire and the North, called the Hogback a colonial monument because, as probably pointed out, it only shows up in the places, they're not in Scandinavia, they only show up in places where they come in and they settle and they start mixing with that population and those pre-existing traditions and ideas and that. So I think one of the slides that I didn't show that I have that shows the kind of complicated relationship between sort of modern ideas of colonialism and immigration and things like that and the Norman conquest is that Nigel Farage is pictured wearing a Bayeux Tapestry tie. And I think that is weird, given his political statements around, immigration and not wanting to be colonialized by foreigners. And yet, he's wearing a tie celebrating William doing this to England. So I don't think, it'd be quite glib, I think, if we sort of directly drew a line. But there are people utilizing things politically in ways that I think they don't have a deep understanding of that past. I don't know.
The only sort of other thing that I would like to add is that the sort of modern conception of colonialism, of sort of one group of people imposing power on another, is sort of, it comes to us from later periods of empire and imperial activity. And I think one of the problems with trying to take that model and impose it on this period is that we've had so much intermixing, and that's kind of what I was hoping to sort of point out with what I was saying, is that you can't really distinguish between the Anglo-Saxons and the Scandinavians and the Franks and the Normans anymore. By this point, they're so churned up by the movements across the North Sea that creating neat ethnic lines is difficult. We also can't create national lines because none of these kingdoms are set in stone yet. England is still emerging until 1066 and arguably even after 1066. There is kind of a Scotland, but kind of not, as Sarah has demonstrated. The kind of divisions, us and them divisions, that are required for colonialism aren't really visible in this period. So I'd be a bit reluctant to call this colonialism. There's invasion, there's conquest, there's settlement, there's migration, there's assimilation, there's acculturation, there's all sorts of other words we can use, but I'd be loath to call it colonialism.
So there was a question there, was that? Yes.
Yes.
That's fine.
For you, Pragya, I think. So there were 19 days between Battle of Stamford Bridge and Hastings, and there's recent speculation about whether they travelled by boat or march. What's your views on that one?
I see no reason why they would have marched. These are all experienced sea-going people, and there's no reason why you would put your army through a forced march, and the bulk of it probably went by sea. Sorry. That's as uncontroversial as I can.
Did they have much evidence?
No, the evidence from the sources is relatively circumstantial, but then we don't really have evidence for the forced march either.
Yeah.
So it's much of a muchness.
Can I come back on that one?
Yeah.
Intuitively, is the story of the Normans in Normandy waiting to invade all about waiting for the right winds?
The right winds, yeah.
So if they get the right winds to travel across the channel, intuitively they're the wrong winds to sail to the south.
Yeah.
I think quite different winds in the...
Yeah, I mean, the North
channel
Sea
is
has different winds to the channel. But sort of, just sort of logically, sort of, from a logistical point of view, you want the shortest possible crossing. And you certainly don't want to deal with the currents in the North Sea. So, yeah. But I mean, we know Harold Godwinson has ships. So it just makes sense that he would use them.
I suppose although there's all those ships in the news at Rickall, that they didn't need to take them back home again. Could I just
Well,
ask?
I mean, the the Vikings
Yeah.
left a whole bunch of ships as well,
Yeah, that's what I mean.
losing
So
it
they're
to
ready
Stamford
to
Bridge.
go back
Exactly.
up. But
Yeah.
can I just ask, the one question you didn't talk about was Morcar. The reason that all these battles happened as they did was because Morcar didn't manage to beat Harold Hardrada and Tostig. Was that possibly, how well embedded was he as a northern earl at that point? Could he not bring together enough of a fighting force to fight them off? Do you think? Is he the new one? Was he a weak leader, or was he just?
He didn't have a chance. He didn't have a chance. All of this went down between 1065 and 1066. So Edwin and Morcar, who shared power in Northumbria, were sort of the co-earls of Northumbria that were appointed by Edward the Confessor. They don't really have a chance to consolidate their power before Tosti and Harold just show up. So we will never know whether he was a good earl or not. Tosti, clearly, according to his brothers, was not going to be a good earl. But we have absolutely no way of knowing about the rest of them.
I'm going to use my privilege to ask a quick question of Sarah at the end here, which is, I was really struck by your connection between Comte and York, and the kind of almost imposition of a kind of, this is what a townscape should look like. Is that imposition specific to York? So are you trying to remake York in the manner of Comte? Or is that something that is seen across other urban townscapes within England?
I think it's probably something. I don't think it is specific to York. I mean, obviously each city is going to have their own specific characteristics and opportunities and so on, barriers. But I think it's something that you could trace more widely around new northern cities, particularly county towns in England. I did once hope to have a big comparative project on that, but it never quite happened. So. But yeah, I mean, just the ones that I've looked at. It's the same things happening broadly speaking, in Norwich, big castellated centre next to the marketplace, religious houses around the outside. It's actually a pretty standard pattern, I think.
There's a question here.
A question for Sarah, actually. Just thinking about the bishops and Durham and the sort of Palatinate power structure, that was an effective way for the kings to delegate authority to parts of the north. And why did that not happen in York or elsewhere as a sort of model to maintain control without baronial shenanigans, I guess?
It's interesting that they do try to create York as the royal bastion in the north, and that they don't immediately delegate it in the same way that these other northern marcher principalities are created. And I do wonder if it's something to do with York's history, actually, as clearly a Roman city and the centre of Christian government in the north of England, that given the Norman conception of themselves as these sort of Roman-like Christian rulers, William has papal blessing, doesn't he, to invade England. You don't just let anybody else, govern York. You're going to make York into your own special capital in the north, and that kind of Christological, ecclesiastical dimension to his power is immensely important, I think, and it's what he's trying to make from scratch in Com, but to an extent in York he has elements of it already, particularly in its past.
Questions? Yeah, Sarah.
My question's for Alexandra. I just wanted to ask about some of the stuff you were talking about was like the, I guess, fusion of pre-conquest and post-conquest bits of architecture, or like whether it be due to craftsmen or like you to respect. Is that purely a northern phenomenon, or is there any other areas of England that show the same kind of thing going on?
So I know less about the detailed things like little parish churches and things like that in other part of the country, but I know that in Exeter, the castle in Exeter, so is one of the very earliest, right after the conquest, and that has to do with needing to take control of where the Godwinsons have a lot of power. And they build Rushmont Castle in Exeter, and it has these, it's definitely post-conquest, but it has these triangular windows, which are not Romanesque in any way, shape or form. So is that about expediency? You know, you need a castle, you need it fast. You don't have time to get the newest architects from Normandy to come over. You build with the guys that you've got, and this is how they know how to build, and this is what you're gonna, you know, you say, I need it to keep, and they put it up and they put their windows in and look what they do. So that's a possibility where it's just, it's certainly not about money, you know, it's not like they don't have the money, it's about time, and it's about expediency, and it's about what you need in the moment. When you have that sort of longer periods of transition, you know, a lot of the churches I'm talking about are not immediate post-conquest. They're somewhere, you know, between, you know, the 1070s, 1080s up to 1100. They've had a long time now. This is not about the expediency. This is about what can I see around me, and what values do I place on it. And I imagine if we do the kind of detailed local studies that I've done for York and Yorkshire, if you do that in any other part of the country, you will see responses to what is already there. One of the things that I've written is that I don't think there's a Norman conquest. I think there's lots of little Norman conquests that happen all over the country, and all of them are very contingent on local needs, pre-existing situations, the patrons who happen to be in that area, that sort of thing. So I imagine if we start digging into things like that, you will see those sorts of connections. And especially in places where you have a thriving industry already. One bit that I do know a little bit more about is the sculptural stuff in further south in England. And in East Anglia, because the stone isn't good, you have very little pre-existing sculpture. And in parts of Lincolnshire and Northamptonshire, they can produce stone. They have limestone, so they can make stone sculpture. And East Anglia imports those in. And in those places in that eastern bit of England where they're already producing sculpture, you start to see the same transitional monuments that you do in the north. But in places where they can't produce stuff beforehand and they're importing, you don't see that level of transition. So I think it needs more kind of regional impetus to start looking at the detail of these individual buildings and individual pieces of sculpture to start to make some of those connections. But my guess is that yes, you will see that kind of thing. It's not just the north. I don't want to set the kind of Norman conquest of the north apart from the Norman conquest of everywhere else. I think there's a Norman conquest of every single place, and it makes it more interesting and more, I think, more real if we look at those kind of local contingencies to see how it actually happened on the ground.
There's a question just there on the right.
Thank you. When the Domesday Book says that large parts of Yorkshire are waste, does that mean there's absolutely nobody living there, or it's just subsistence farmers who are not worth taxing? Or does it mean there were people living there before and they've now abandoned it?
It's kind of difficult to say. So there have been people who know a lot more about Domesday Book than I do who've looked at this. And there have been people kind of questioning what does waste actually mean. And it doesn't mean that there's nobody there. It doesn't mean that nothing is happening in that village. It means that you can't tax the agricultural value of it. And one of the other things that Domesday reports, which is kind of weird and obscure, is like ploughed lands and ploughed teams. And what we see in the north is that a lot of times there's more ploughed lands than the ploughed teams that are there in 1086. So you would expect there to be a certain amount of plough teams to plough that amount of land, and there's less of them. So it just looks like it's kind of economically and agriculturally depressed, as opposed to being empty. And I think the idea of it being empty is very hard to support. I mean, we know that there are lots and lots of people who did not die in the conquest. You know, the vast majority of people did not get killed. They had to keep living somewhere. But they may have had a harder time, there was less
lordship kind of to manage and control, because a lot of the lords have been killed, those guys had been killed or were disenfranchised. So there wasn't the kind of management on the ground to make the manors work to their maximum efficiency. I think that's probably a lot of the source of waste, as opposed to sort of pure destruction. Say anything else?
I think that's right. I mean, there's been a lot of work on what does the word waste mean, as Alex said. I think the short answer is that it's what you say when you can't find an answer to the question.
Why is there no money here?
And that's why I was so interested when I came to look in detail at the language in the description of the City of York. They don't use the word waste very, they use it on one occasion, which is about the castles. Otherwise, they use these very much more specific, less ambiguous words like empty and uninhabited. Yeah.
And Yorkshire is hard because it's so big. And also one of the things that Doomsday Book, what's interesting about Doomsday Book is Yorkshire is as far north as it goes. They don't have enough control further north of Yorkshire. It's not safe to go there. They can't ask people to ascertain what they should be getting in tax from there. Yorkshire is as far north as it goes, and Yorkshire is tough. So there's a lot of formulaic aspects to it. They're getting through a whole lot of manors, and they're doing it relatively quickly for William. So they would just be like, nope, waste, there's nothing there. So it's just, you're not going to get any tax out of these guys, William. Let's just draw a line.
I feel like I'm really joking there about Yorkshire and if someone comes and asks if you've got
Can I just bring, if you forgive me, arguments, could we bring it locally down here? Because we've got a pre-Norman church, there's an Anglo-Saxon stone cross in it, and then a very quickly built stone church, the 1130s of one half, in the 1860s, the other half. But no village around it, not that's been found at all. And then we've got this village here, running down Lane Street, this Croft and Toft, and back lanes, classic layout. In the Doomsday Book, Louise is the expert, not me, but forgive me if I'm wrong, but it doesn't describe it as waste, but it does talk about the huge reduction in production
The
power.
drop in value.
Yes, and value. And so I wonder if each of you might have something to say about, if it can explain what's gone on here. Was the village here, and what's happened to his wealth through the conquest process?
I think that's that indicator. Those drops in value we see really consistently across. So there's a few places in Yorkshire which go up in value between 1066 and 1086, that they get somebody on the ground really quickly and he starts, managing the estate to make it efficient again. But the vast majority of places you see drop from having some value, maybe not very high compared to the rest of the country, but having some value to having very little or none. And I think that's the indicator of that. Is it being managed to efficiency? So it doesn't mean that nobody lives here. It just means that they're not cultivating it agriculturally to the amount that it could be. And those drops in value can be about how many people, can be about livestock. Can you get enough livestock to plow the land that you've got? It can be about just, do you have somebody in charge who can make the people do what they probably don't want to do in the amounts that they're going to have to do to make this manor produce. I think it's Ollie Crichton, who's an archaeologist in Exeter, who said the Norman conquest for the peasantry, it just means you have a lord who speaks French and he's making you work a bit harder. So that seems to be, I think, there's drops in value that's really consistent across Yorkshire. It's probably that kind of indicator.
A tiny bit to add there, which is that in this period between 1066, actually it's kind of goes before 1066 as well, because of the sort of upheaval and because of the constantly changing sort of centres of power. One of the other things we get is a drop in trade. York has always been a trading port, a trading city, and these settlements along the river to York would have benefited from that kind of trade. And when that gets depressed, the effects would have been felt in the villages as well. So you've probably seen something like that in Fulford.
I'm just going to mention coins at that point. Coins, York is the major source of minting in northern England, the only major coins are struck, and they are made in there at least hundreds of thousands, if not millions, into the mid-1060s, and there's a massive drop, while there's very few money is striking them in the late 1060s and early 1070s. But even by, which would be exactly line up with the point, in that there's no silver to be made, but into coins, there's less trade going on, that would be my kind of understanding of that. But even by the late 1070s, early 1080s, and certainly by 1086, when Domesday Book had been written, you've gone through the bottom of that thing and coming back out the other side. It's a very swift drop and very swift climb once more until really by the 1090s you wouldn't know that anything had happened in the middle. So, I would see it in that context as well. But I would absolutely take the point about the trend. There was a question right at the back, I think.
I think it's partly a comment, but maybe a question. The comment is, with regard to plough teams and ploughland, to what extent does Domesday take account of husband? Take account of husbandry, with animals, raising, pasture.
You mentioned,
there's lots of mentions of how many pigs and how many cows and how many various animals there are associated with each bill. So it is trying to take account of as much as possible. Whether it succeeds,
it's really variable. It's really variable county to county. So some of them are exceptionally detailed, down to the number of pigs, and others in Yorkshire, not tons. Not so much. No, they're certainly not counting animals, I think, as the standard. They are mentioning meadow and pasture, the acreage of meadow and pasture. But
there are some mentions of animals.
There's some, but it's not
systematic.
it's not nearly as much as you might expect.
I suppose what it means that one shouldn't pay too much attention to plough teams, because they may not have needed plough teams to the extent that other places would. But my question now is, it's been very interesting to compare the amount of information in York compared with the amount of information in Richmond and villages that you described there with their churches. Keep going. Obviously in York it was possible to go down a lot of detail to the mansiones and the people living in them, what they were doing. Whereas in Richmond, people were still building churches. Churches were important. Churches had congregations. But there is very little knowledge about what's happening on the ground. Were they planning villages at that time? What evidence is there now? Not just Richmondshire.
Okay, so I'll answer that. I'll hand over to Sarah, who will know much more about York. And actually, the reason we know so much about York is because Sarah has spent a career digging through all of the documentary evidence for these mansiones and things like that. I have not done that level of digging because I'm not a historian. So I trusted what the...
Chris, will you turn the turn that one off.
So I've trusted the descent of the manor in the Victorian County history, and who happens to be the lord at this point. In terms of planning, if you look at villages in Yorkshire, a lot of them are very regular. They have regular-sized burgage plots. They're arranged on both sides of the street. The manor and the church are together at one end. That kind of thing. And that, in an article in the 1970s, Patricia Allerston looked at villages in Rydale, I think, and she made the argument that this is post-harrying reorganization. The Normans come in and they replan all these villages which must have been burnt. But that was kind of assuming that the harrying had been burning everything, just like the Chronicles said. I think some of the studies like at Warren Percy and things like that have shown that level of planning goes back much further than the Norman Conquest. You know, there's definitely levels of organisation and planning in the villages in the 10th century. David Stocker and Paul Everson have shown that for Lincolnshire. That organisation around greens is, and it's not all lords. Some areas have a lot of freemen, and they're planning things. So there is definitely a level of organisation and planning. It depends on where you are in the country and what the situation is, who's in charge of that planning. But Chris Dyer would argue for the southwest that it's a lot of dispersed villages and individuals and not a lot of centralised lordship. Yorkshire, there's not many freemen. It looks a lot more like it's kind of centralised lordship, but it may already be well planned by the time the Normans get here, and they're not going to turn their noses up at that. They're going to, take it, adapt it, and accelerate it, like they do most every other thing. All those processes of church building and things like that, they're already happening too. They just ramp it up because it serves their purposes. So I don't think it's particularly a kind of result of the Norman Conquest or a particular Norman initiative out in the villages. I think sometimes it will be, and other times it will have already been there, and they will have just taken it and run with it. But York, maybe, story.
Yeah, I mean, your main question is, was it why do we know more about York than about other places?
I accept that we know more about York, and I think you'll struggle to find that little bit
Detail,
out.
York also has more documents than, yeah.
Yeah. I think that is partly true, that there is more information for cities. I don't know if it is. Honestly, I think the information exists where people have looked for it and found it, is the honest answer. And you get, for example, really intensive studies of peasant communities around the University of Birmingham in the West Midlands, because for 3 generations there were scholars there who were intensely interested in the development of peasant communities, and you could. Somebody once told me when I was a young scholar that never believe the pattern of archaeological finds. They just represent the routes that archaeologists took to get to work. And I think the same is true to an extent of documents as well. I mean, I was told when I began my study of property ownership in the city of York many decades ago, that it was impossible to do because all the core sources had been lost, all the urban government records, the civic records had been lost. So I just went and found records elsewhere in other archives belonging to other landowners and found a lot in the end. So it's really hard to answer your question because I think it is actually, we know about places where people have looked and found evidence. I've recently been doing a lot of work on other Yorkshire market towns, and there is so much more that we could say about them from their topography, from their archaeology, from their documentary culture than has ever been written about them. It's just nobody's done it yet. But that might seem like a rather feeble answer to your question. I hope it encourages you to go and look.
Yeah. It's certainly the case for like I was saying about the detailed studies that I've been able to do on churches and grave monuments in Yorkshire. It took me a really long time to do, and there's a lot of them. And you could, anybody could do that for any other county in England. They just haven't done it. So I think, the fact that I found those, these interesting patterns and things like that is because I looked for them. It doesn't mean that they're not anywhere else. It's just that they maybe haven't looked for them yet.
Thank you.
I'm going to wrap things up there. I'm sorry, there's more questions. I think we could keep going all afternoon, but we might have to stop here. So I'll just briefly sum up and then I'll thank our speakers. So it'd be really easy to talk about 1066 and the Norman Conquest, or any Norman Conquest, as I may refer to it now on, by thinking about 1 year and some battle sites, battlefields. But actually I think what we have heard this morning is that we need to think about what happens before and the kind of deep context for that, and then also particularly what then happens afterwards. And we can't understand that moment in time without both of those things. That's been really beautifully illustrated by our 3 speakers today. And then also that we can analyse it at different scales. We can analyse it at the kind of micro-urban scale, almost on a plot-by-plot basis, across a region or across the whole of England, and indeed right across northwestern Europe, and you get different understanding at each of those scales. And all of our speakers today have emphasised complexity, and also, although whilst speaking in a really effective and straightforward manner. But I think if we can almost take anything from this is that, yeah, 1066 is great, but it's not everything. And so I'll leave it there. The last thing I'll just say is, could we thank our speakers again for what has been a fantastic morning.